is from BP's report. It's pretty basic, but it's sort of their analysis, their conclusions as to what causes them. We won't need to go into details here. By the way, of course, their report has received a lot of criticism, rightfully so, recently, that they basically looked at the immediate technical details, but didn't look at their organizational system adequately. Basically, they're blaming the contractors, and they didn't really look adequately at themselves. No great surprise there, huh? This is the actual Deepwater Horizon blowout preventer, just as they were installing it. The thing is huge, you know, it's 400 tons. This will not be on the test at the end of the conference. But it's a pretty complicated piece of piping and electronics, and it's an incredibly technical piece of equipment. These things usually work, right? There's several blowouts a year in offshore rigs. Normally the blowout preventer catches it, but one of the classic offshore disasters was the Ekofisk disaster in the North Sea. It had a blowout preventer. This was in 1979, but you won't believe what happened. They installed the blowout preventer upside down. I mean, look at it. It's, you know, I could install that thing upside down. But it just goes to show us that, yeah, people make mistakes. People will continue making mistakes, no matter how safe we make this. But of course, the underlying causes are corporate negligence. I personally believe that BP will be found grossly negligent, entitling the government to collect the $1,000, or I'm sorry, the $4,300 per barrel spilled, which is where the number of barrels spilled becomes very relevant. Human error, we've talked about that, equipment malfunction, and certainly a huge player here is ineffective government oversight. The responsible parties, we all know about the top one, certainly. They are the lease operator and the lease holder, so legally they have financial liability, BP does. However, there's all these other companies from here up that were involved and made mistakes as well. This business has become so convoluted that subcontractors, contractors, are making a lot of decisions. But BP has had experience with contractors not doing the right thing before. In the North Slope of Alaska, it escapes me right now, the field, but they had a contractor intentionally dumping and re-injecting hazardous waste into a relief well, into a disposal well, and then concealed it from the government, and they had a felony plea agreement, and they were, I believe they may still be on criminal probation. So it's not like mismanagement of contractors is new to any of these companies. Endicott, yeah, I believe that was it, thanks. Regardless, this is the largest accidental spill in human history, anywhere. If you use the official numbers, you come up with 4.1 million barrels, about 170 million gallons, or 500,000 tons. Some places use tons, some places use gallons, some places actually use liters, but it can get confusing, and you see often people mistranslating this. But this is the famous NOAA pie chart that we all know and love so well. And it's interesting, you know, the people at the White House that saw this, it wasn't, my understanding, it wasn't NOAA that released this. They did the study. It was a 4-page scientific study, 4 pages, not very exhaustive, to be safe. They sent it over to the White House. The White House saw this and said, presto, bingo, let's get this out. It shows that most of the oil is gone. Well, if you just read this, naturally dispersed and chemically dispersed, you add those to residual, you come up with more than half is still in the environment. And NOAA has been very cautious lately in reiterating this, that the report really didn't say it was all gone. Plus, a component of the dissolved component, which we know is pretty toxic stuff, was in the water, and that's not necessarily gone either. So if you read the report correctly, it does not say that most of the oil is gone. In fact, it says most of it is still there. You all know the 3-month debacle of trying to respond to the blowout and trying to contain it. And I liken it to sort of building the fire truck while your house is burning down. It's not really the right sequencing of things. They should have had this stuff, you know, well engineered, tested, on the rigs, on boats, on shore, ready to go before they were permitted to drill out there. And they know it, and it's up to us to make sure this never happens again. But you know, they tried the pollution containment chamber, which clogged with methane hydrate crystals. Then they tried the top hat, which basically they didn't even try. They just set it down on the ocean floor and said, this thing's not going to work. And after building it and deploying it, and then they tried the riser insertion tube, which got 1,000 barrels or so a day. Then they did the top kill, the famous, infamous top kill, where they pumped hundreds of tons of the heavy synthetic drilling muds down the old blowout preventer, trying to back pressure this thing. It was about 8,000 PSI pressure beneath the blowout preventer. They just couldn't overcome it. Muds were leaving the drill stem into the surrounding geology, letting them know that, yeah, there is a failure. There's some sort of a failure in the drill stem up near the surface. And plus, it was just blowing right back out. If you saw, remember the images that were coming out during the top kill, it was still coming out pretty hard and heavy, but it was mostly mud. And then they tried, of course, the infamous golf balls. I should get a picture of a bunch of golf balls and put in here, I think. And then, of course, the relief wells, they didn't get going for a couple of weeks. They should have been out there ready to go day 2 at least. This is something we need to work on before they're permitted to go again. You all know the source. I loved the terminology here, the source. It sounded like something out of a Harry Potter movie or something. But, you know, this took 3 months to kill this blowout, to temporarily kill it until 5 months when they permanently killed it with the relief wells. One of the things I did a lot through this is media would dump documents to me, ask me to review them and comment on them. So the first USA Today got me the BP oil spill response plan. I read through it really quickly and very quickly came to this, which I see as a great t-shirt that Aaron and some other folks are wearing around here. That they were talking about walruses and seals and sea otters as species of concern in the Gulf of Mexico Regional Oil Spill Response Plan. And then secondly, and even I almost fell out of my chair when I came to this, there's an equipment list to the Marine Spill Response Corporation, equipment to be used in a oil spill response in the Gulf of Mexico. You click on it and you come up to a Japanese home shopping network. And I had to do it about 8 or 9 times just to believe what I was doing. I asked several of my friends to do it too. The USA Today guys did it and nobody could believe it. Finally, we tracked down the one guy that wrote this plan for BP. He said he was paid $6,000, right? That wouldn't buy the drinks for one of their cocktail parties. It just shows how little they seriously paid attention to the possibility of a worst case discharge. I mean, it's outrageous, actually, but you know the burn story, they say they burned about 8% or something like that. I find that questionable. I was actually surprised that it burned as well as it did, but they did burn. Here's our photographic evidence. But of course, one of the early problems was the entrainment of turtles and probably other marine life in the burns, and then CBD filed suit, and the only thing, they settled that basically to require that there be observers trying to make sure that there were no turtles in the oil before they lit it on fire. It was probably only partially, at best, effective. The other thing about burns, and I've seen this in several other oil spills, is that, well, of course, you've got a lot of atmospheric emissions from them, but the residual oil on the water becomes negatively buoyant, it sinks, and you'll find these, I worked on a spill in the eastern Mediterranean off of Lebanon during the Israel-Lebanon war in 2006. A lot of the oil burned, and divers went down and got video for us of these huge mats. The entire seafloor was just covered with these thick black mats of oil that was the residue. So some of this residue could find its way, it's certainly on the seabed out in the Gulf right now, but who knows how densely you can find it. This is an issue we could spend all day talking about, the dispersant issue. There's people in this room that could talk more eloquently about it, but certainly dispersants, they're the industry favorite. You know, it gets the oil, if it works as engineered, it would get the oil off the surface and keep it away from the beaches if it's offshore. They've used these throughout the world, never quite as much, as far as I know, as here. The 2 dispersants they used, Corexit, 9527 and 9500, we had a nickname for them in Alaska. We called it Hides It, 9527, because if they work as designed, that's essentially what they do, is to reduce the surface tension of the slick into smaller break the oil into smaller droplets, and then with turbulent mixing, those would mix down into the upper mixed layer of the water. They have to be used at about 10 to 20 knots of wind to be effective. There's got to be some mixing. If you're over 20 knots of wind, the natural dispersion is going to do everything your chemical dispersion would do anyway, and they're unnecessary. If it's under 10 knots, you don't have enough energy to do anything with it. And I think a lot of the dispersion that happened in the Gulf was natural dispersion, to be honest with you. And you can see, I mean, this guy's obviously vectoring the winds. There's not much, but it looks to me like he's missing whatever slick is there in the first place. But the other thing about this oil coming up from 5,000 feet, of course, is it was heavily emulsified with water. And I just don't think there's much evidence that the chemical dispersion actually worked. I tried to get data from EPA and NOAA about the blowout application of dispersant, and all they finally came up with was post-dispersant application data, droplet size. They could not provide me any pre-dispersant application droplet size, so you really couldn't tell if it was having an effect at all. The other thing about dispersants, before I move off of them, is that there is a more effective, less toxic dispersant that BP even identified in their letter back to EPA, which is called JD 2000. It's known to be more effective on Gulf crude and less toxic than the Corexit products. Apparently it wasn't available, but why not? Yes, ma'am.
We know that the dispersants that they use are pretty toxic, and they're going to be used a long time.
Certainly, and the other interesting, scary thing about some of them, there's a body of research that shows that there is a mild toxicity in some of the dispersant, more toxicity in the oil, but the combination of the dispersant and the oil can actually have a synergistic toxicity that is more than the sum of the two individual toxicities. So, and a lot of the things that they test in their toxicity tests, Ricky could, I'm sure, talk about this, are not the more sensitive stages, life history stages, the juveniles, the larvae, eggs, and such like that, which we know are generally more susceptible to this kind of stuff. So, yeah, we know it's toxic. And some of it, the one that I think the 9527 that has a stuff called 2-butoxyethanol in it. That's pretty nasty stuff. So.
Do we know what quantity they use?
What quantity of dispersants they use? 1.8 million gallons, if you believe their numbers, and they said, I think it was something like 1.3 million on the surface and 400,000 gallons or something at the blowout site. Down at the wellhead. So my question is, if they can't tell you that it was absolutely necessary or effective down at the blowout, then why add this variable into the situation? Generally, the oil that's coming out of that blowout is pretty small droplet size in the first place. So I don't know that adding dispersant there was doing a darn thing, but it looked good for the TV cameras, and that stuff looked good too. Mechanical recovery. This is one of the numbers of the report that I agree completely with. It may have been about 3%, which is pretty low, but to be fair to the responders, this stuff was pretty heavily emulsified. It was just slipping. These are some of the boats, the shrimp boats, on contract, pulling boom around. Some of them would pass through oil slicks and just not get much. You know, I think our shrimp fishermen know that better than anybody.